All right, good afternoon, everybody. Dr. Neil Lesinski here. I really appreciate all of you taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us for this Ed Leaders Network session on the power of conversations. Love seeing those of you from around the country, as well as those of you from close by. I'm actually a resident of Lake County, so hello to all of my CEDAL colleagues over there, but much appreciated. I also appreciate you responding to the two survey questions. I have them up here on my phone. And I find it interesting when we talk about the idea of psychological safety. The responses ranged from a 1 being feeling like there's a very low level of psychological safety within your teams to all the way up to a 5. And so we're going to be talking about that as one of two very important factors in creating a learning organization, which in many ways will be the most important thing for your organizations into the future, is to be a learning organization. The second factor is that of accountability. The responses that you all gave, we have, again, ranging from a 1 to a 5, but much heavier in the 1, 2, and 3 areas. And so what that tells me is that I hope all of us here today will get something out of this presentation. And so I'm wanting to treat this like a conversation. If you have anything that you'd like to ask or provide within the chat, I am happy to pause and answer any questions that you put into the chat. We'll also have periods of time where you can stop and talk with your team if you're at a table with a teammate or a group of people, or self-reflect, and then I'll be calling for some responses in the chat as well. So I'm trying to keep it as engaging as possible. The first thing I wanted to start off with is why are we here? What are our goals? What are my goals? And really, I try to simplify it down to two things. First and foremost, I hope to convey and help you understand how intentional and open conversations can foster a team culture with both a combination of psychological safety and accountability. And we're going to talk about where that comes from, why I chose those two factors. And then number 2 is to give you strategies that you can use and implement with your teams to improve the psychological safety and accountability and really establish the conditions to become a learning organization. So where did this presentation come from? Where did this topic come from? Myself, I'm in my second year as a superintendent. I spent 6 years as a high school principal. And then prior to that, I was a director of curriculum as well as a department chair for 2 different departments. I've had the good fortune of working on really, really great teams. And I've had the misfortune, if you will, of working on some teams that struggled in each of these 2 areas of psychological safety and accountability. It is my goal now with my team to help us improve in these 2 areas. And so I actually did an administrative academy for my entire leadership team this past summer that focused on this exact topic. And the feedback was that they felt, many others could benefit from this. And so that's what really brought me here today, is to try and offer this to other teams in hopes that it will help you all improve as well. So those are our 2 goals today. So why is this important? And I mentioned this already, but the literature out there now is saying that the most successful organizations of today and tomorrow are those that are able to learn and adapt. And I think all of us in education have seen this probably more so this year with the influx of AI platforms and things infiltrating the educational system and everything else in our lives. We have to be able to learn and adapt in a way that provides the best opportunities for both our students as well as our staff to meet the needs of our students. A great quote that I heard recently is from Bill Gates, talking about the biggest enemy of future success is the unwillingness to learn, unlearn, relearn, change, and grow. And I think of those 5 terms or 5 words, learn, unlearn, relearn, change, and grow, the scariest one for many of our teams is the idea of change. And I would encourage you all to consider that if you are a team that is focused on learning and growth, then you're also a team that can take on change and help your entire staff amidst change as well. The question I have is, Bill Gates talks about this unwillingness, but it may actually be an inability of our teams to do these things, because if we don't foster that sense of high accountability and high psychological safety within our teams, it is really unfair for us to expect them to have this ability to learn and grow. And so the question becomes, well, Neil, you're talking about this learning organization. What does that actually mean? And so the literature that I'll be pointing to here throughout the presentation, it starts with Dr. Amy C. Edmondson's work out of the Harvard Business School. And she wrote this book called The Fearless Organization, which really talks about the intersection of psychological safety and accountability as a place where organizations need to go in order to become adept at change and really working together in a collaborative way that is beyond what we may imagine possible. And so really what she talks about is that high levels of both psychological safety and accountability are exactly what we need in order for our teams to be learners and be collaborative learners together. So I wanted to begin here by just talking briefly about, what is psychological safety, and then what am I talking about when I say accountability. And the first thing with psychological safety, I think many of us have this common understanding, but it's a climate where individuals feel safe to talk, to take risks, to talk, to speak up. They make mistakes in a way that is leaning into those mistakes. They're not afraid to make mistakes. They realize that mistakes are an avenue towards learning and growth. And there's a willingness to share ideas without this fear of judgment or retribution. And I am sure with the amount of experience that is in this session right now, all of us have experienced organizations or teams that have various levels of psychological safety. Many of you responded that your organizations are at a 3 or below, and while some of us might be sitting at a 4 or 5. I would tell you my organization right now is probably still in need of some growth. And so I think it's just something that we're always keeping tabs on. We're always checking the pulse of the psychological safety within our teams and working towards improving that. The key elements of psychological safety is the idea of trust, which we're going to talk about today, the openness and mutual respect, regardless of rank within the organization, and a sense that people are going to be themselves without facing judgment by their teammates. And so right now, what I'd like you just to think about, and you can respond in the chat, or you can just reflect on it, talk with your teams, but think of an example of a team with high levels of psychological safety, and what did that look like? And I'll share an example of that in just about 20, 30 seconds. So I'm just going to take a pause. If you'd like to give some descriptors of what a psychologically safe team looks like in the chat, that would be great. All right, we have one response there, being able to share thoughts without retribution, being able to disagree and share multiple points of view. Absolutely. So healthy discourse is an outstanding attribute of a psychologically safe team. The ability to work through challenging work effectively, honestly, and hold one another accountable. Absolutely. And I think honesty is something that we look for in our teams. And especially if you're leading a team and you're at the head of that table and you ask people for their opinions, if they're not providing them, then they are not giving an opportunity to the entire team to reach the best outcome possible. And I think it's really important that we talk to our teams about that. If we're not sharing openly at the table, then we're actually holding the entire team back. And so when we think about those high levels of psychological safety, those are teams, as you all said, that are speaking up at the table. They're sharing their perspective, knowing that it might not be a popular opinion, but it's still an opinion that can help us reach the best outcome possible. We're going to talk about strategies to create more psychologically safe environments in just a bit. So next up is accountability, the other factor that we're going to be focusing on today, and that is the practice of holding individuals responsible for their actions, their results, as well as their commitments. When people say they're going to do something, we need to hold them accountable for actually doing those things. Key elements. So there is, with accountability, there's a connection to ownership. People realize, like, when I say I'm going to do this, a part of me is responsible for doing this, and it reflects on me if I don't do it. People understand that commitment means commitment. I'm going to see this through all the way to the end. And there's a sense of performance. And so what Edmondson really warns people against is accountability is not at the cost of psychological safety and vice versa. And so we're going to talk about the different quadrants here in just a second. But it's not about giving and taking from accountability to give over to psychological safety. It's about finding a balance. And the more we can hold people accountable, the better your psychological safety also exists within the team. And so another question I have for the group is just, can you think of an example of how low accountability has negatively impacted a team? And I'll share an example here as you just reflect on that. But I worked on a team where we had a number of staff in a department, and this was not in my current district, but we had one staff member that just wasn't pulling their weight. And so it became very frustrating for the rest of our team that this staff member wasn't pulling their weight. The unfortunate part was that this staff member was not held accountable for their responsibilities, and therefore it was a drain on the rest of the team, and it impacted culture in a way where the rest of the team said, well, why should I be working so hard if I'm going to be rated the same as this other individual, or if I'm going to get the same treatment as somebody else that maybe isn't working as hard? And so I love what Darren shared here. No progress gets made, and the group begins to splinter. And I think it's an outstanding word. If there's no accountability, then what happens is people begin to resent either their colleagues or the workplace in general. They start to feel that the team is not effective. And let's be real, people don't want to be a part of ineffective teams. So when we take these two things and place them together, this is again the work of Edmondson. This is not my work. This is research based out of Harvard, but we look at the four different quadrants. And so what I want you to realize is at the very top of this is for meeting demanding goals. These are for high performance organizations and teams. This is not the work of teams that just want to be average. This is what we need to do in order to make our teams really, really effective. And so if you look in that top left quadrant there, the comfort zone, that's when you have high levels of psychological safety, but you have low levels of accountability. And that's when people love to work together, but they're not really challenged and they're not really pushing the status quo. They're not pushing the edges of what's possible. They're not challenging themselves to do things differently, to meet the needs of kids in a different way, or to be innovative and creative. They really just enjoy working together, which is wonderful. I think we would prefer that over the alternative. However, we realize that there's something missing. The same is true of that bottom right-hand quadrant, the anxiety zone. And so this is a place where we might have high levels of accountability, but we have low levels of psychological safety. And so this is where people are tiptoeing around issues. They don't want to bring up opinions or share ideas because they're fearful. And there's not a lot of innovation. There's no piloting of different programs. They're not trying new things because they don't want to be wrong. They don't want to be caught in a situation. They don't want to be called to the table, and they're fearful basically all the time. And so this can manifest itself in a number of different ways, but we call it the anxiety zone for obvious reasons, and we don't want to be a part of an anxious team or an anxious organization. But when those two factors come together in the top right-hand corner, that's what we refer to as the learning zone. And this is where we are focused on collaboration and learning in the service of high performance outcomes. And again, this is a balancing act of addressing things, holding people accountable, while also keep creating space where people can share and be vulnerable. So how do conversations play into this? And I hesitated with this title because it comes across as somewhat soft. Conversations, we have them every day, all day. And I think oftentimes we think of conversations as just things that happen in passing. But I would tell you that every conversation you have, whether it be one-on-one, small group, or a large team, is an opportunity to advance your organization in different ways. And specifically, for our purposes today, in that quadrant of moving your organization towards the learning zone. So before I start any team or meeting, we, as a group here, go back to our tenets of trust, or our trust accelerators, or our group norms, whatever you might call them. And this is just an example of that. But I wanted to apply this to the webinar today and give you an example of what tenets of trust might be for your organization. So what we always talk about here is what is said here in this room stays here. What is learned here, however, leaves here. We need to take the learning with us and spread that gift to everybody else. Our focus as a team, and our focus here in this webinar, is on the learning and creating the conditions for us to learn best as a team. And so we're going to talk about conditions in a little bit as well. And then the last thing I remind my team of, and sometimes I do this more often than not, because if the room is very quiet around an issue, I remind them of this again, but we all have a unique voice that makes all of us better. And if we were to treat any voices at the table differently than the others, then automatically what we're saying is we value some voices over others, And now we are creating an environment where people feel anxious, and we're creating low levels of psychological safety. And so it's a great reminder for our teams when we go through these tenets of trust that I value everyone's voice at the table because it makes everybody better. And so this is a great way to begin any meeting, or if you want to talk with your team, what are your tenets of trust? What are your group norms? If you haven't visited those recently, this is a great opportunity to do that and establish the conditions for great conversations. So the first thing I want to talk about today is the role of conversations in building psychological safety and accountability. And I tried to create some simplicity in this. So hopefully there's some things here you can take away. So conversations are really a tool. As I said, every one of them is an opportunity. And when you can create open and transparent communication, you're building trust among your team. At the same time, when you're providing clear and constructive feedback to people, that's when you're able to foster ownership and responsibility, which leads obviously to accountability. So when we think about what that looks like, how do we do this with our teams? I broke this down into 4 types of conversations. And we're going to go through each one of these briefly, but these 4 types of conversations are all equally important. And as a leader, you have a responsibility to have each one of these types of conversations throughout your days, your weeks, and your months, and with each of your employees, whether that be your direct reports or those that are a few layers apart from you. We want to make sure that we're doing our best and we're putting in a process that allows us to have these types of conversations with each of our people. And in some ways, you're going to have more of these with your inner circle of teammates, and then you'll probably have less of these with the rings that come outside of those. But each of us has a different structure of our teams, and so I didn't want to get too into depth on that. So the first category are courageous conversations. These are really the ones that we walk into a room and we're there to share some difficult feedback. And we're maybe discussing the issues or mistakes that someone has made, the lack of contribution that they're providing, the lack of accountability, things like that. But when we do that, we approach those conversations in a way we're helping them learn. We're not placing blame on them. And again, these are extremely important when we're talking about accountability. This is a slightly different type of conversation, a coaching conversation. It's not necessarily addressing issues. It's more trying to help people grow by encouraging them to reflect and kind of dig internally as to what are things that they can improve on, and how are you helping them see their blind spots? How are you helping them bring about more self-awareness? A lot of times coaching conversations are with a lot of questions for people. Courageous conversations are slightly more direct, and that's when we're maybe providing more of a statement of, here's what I need from you, here's what I'm looking for from you, here's what the team is needing from you. Coaching conversations are more, have you thought about different ways you can contribute to the team? Have you thought about ways that this specific talent you possess can help our team in a different way? The third type is an alignment conversation. I think sometimes we assume that our team has shared goals. And I know that one of the things that was placed in the chat earlier, or just a minute ago from Darren, was the idea of having shared goals. And so we can develop goals, we can have strategic plans, but we have to consistently have alignment conversations around our goals, each of our particular roles in achieving those goals, and then the expectations that we have for ourselves and for each other. Alignment conversations for me oftentimes happen in larger groups when I'm having like a leadership team meeting, but they also can happen individually as you meet with your team at the beginning of the year about what their goals might be for the year, and then throughout those checkpoints. And again, I think these are sometimes conversations that are not had as often as the others, because it's not necessarily that we're addressing problems. We're more so trying to be proactive in aligning our efforts around common understandings of goals. And then lastly, I think the fun one are the celebration conversations. And again, this can sometimes be neglected, and sometimes this is something that leaders only do, and they neglect the other 3 categories. But celebration conversations are important. We want to recognize everybody's achievements and reinforce the positive behaviors that are happening. So maybe if you've had a courageous conversation with someone and they've made a positive change, there's an opportunity to follow up with a celebration conversation with them as well. And so I just want you to take I say a few minutes here, but let's take about 30 seconds. And I'd love for you just to think to yourself, or again, talk with your team, but rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 4. with one being which one of these conversations are you doing consistently and effectively, and a 4 is the conversation you need to grow in. What's the area that you want to see growth in? So let's take 30 seconds to reflect on that and talk with your team briefly. All right. So I want to make sure I mentioned that we will be talking towards the end of this presentation about different ways that we can effectively improve in each of these areas by some simple strategies that I'll share. And wherever you fall in this continuum, what I'll tell you is personally, I fluctuate. So I would tell you right now in this very moment, I don't feel like I'm having enough coaching conversations. And that's due to a number of different factors. I'd like to believe that it's because I have full confidence in my team and that I feel that they're all at this they've all arrived at excellent leadership. But I would tell you it's more just a demand for time. And so I think as you go through life, as you go through the different ebbs and flows of just personal and professional obligations, you'll find yourself arriving at the point where, you might be having one or two of these often, and others might be put on the back burner. And so it's really just a way to make sure that we're continuing to find ways to do each of these. And that's what I mean by a process. And I want to talk about that briefly here for a second. Is the idea of building and maintaining trust is thrown around a lot, right? Trust is extremely important. You can't accomplish anything unless you have trust. And so what I've found super helpful, and this is what I use with my team when I talk about the idea of building trust, is this pyramid. And at the very foundation of the pyramid are those 4 types of conversations that you're having. And we really have to find a way to put in place a process to ensure that we're having those conversations consistently. What does that look like, Neil? You're speaking in vague terms. Really, what I'm talking about is I schedule consistent meetings with my team. And in those meetings, I basically decide for myself which of these types of conversations do I need to have with each of those individuals. So if I'm meeting with a building principal who's really crushing it and doing a nice job, I'm not necessarily needing a courageous conversation, but I do need to coach them a little bit. I might need to help them align. Maybe they've kind of gone off rogue and they're working on this thing, this goal, this pilot program, and we need to bring some other people on board with that. Then I might have a little bit of an alignment conversation with them, but also celebrate the work that they're achieving. And so every time I have those on my calendar, I reflect on this process or on these 4 types of conversations, and I try to make sure that I'm entering that discussion with those in mind. That's the foundation of trust. The second tier to this pyramid is presence. You have to be spending time with your team on all levels of the organization. You have to be present with them in order to continue to build relationships and build trust. And I'm not going to dive too much into presence because we're more focused on process today. The third level of this is the relationships that you develop with folks. Are you investing in building quality relationships with all members of your team at all levels? And again, it's not necessarily that you have to know the names of their kids and their pets and everything else, but are you showing a genuine interest in serving the needs of your different constituents that are part of your team? And then finally, at the very tip of this pyramid is when we have established that level of trust. And in order to maintain that, unfortunately, you can't just sit on the tip of that pyramid. You have to continuously work through those other 3 levels. And so this is just, again, a visual and a tool that I use with my team. And I encourage my team to do exactly what I do with them, with their people as well. So my principals are hopefully having these same types of processes in place with the people at their buildings. And so I wanted to talk briefly about an example here and get some feedback from each of you. I don't know if you recall, over the summer, we had a shutdown of CrowdStrike, which is a software platform that many airlines use, and Delta Airlines being one of them. And so I actually took some time. I wanted to look and see what Delta Airlines was all about. And so this is the agreed upon mission statement, vision statement, and values of Delta Airlines. I want to use this as a little bit of a case study here for a minute. So at Delta Airlines, their mission statement is all their constituents, all their stakeholders are working together to form this positive change and global change through their business efforts. And they're dedicated to bettering the standards of life and the environment wherever their customers live and work. They want to be the world's most trusted airline. We talk about that word trust. They want people to trust them. And then lastly, their values are really centered around, again, honesty, integrity, respect, perseverance. And then the last one I found really interesting is servant leadership. They want to care for everyone, regardless of rank. Well, Delta Airlines was met with some adversity over the summer, as were all the airlines, when the CrowdStrike disaster struck. And so what we saw were headlines. They talked about this idea of service, but then once this issue happened, everything failed. They had no systems in place as backups, and they realized that their organization was very fragmented. And so departments were isolated and they were not communicating with one another. Additionally, what we saw as a recovery from the other airlines was pretty rapid. Within a few days, the other airlines had managed to get things back online, and some of them actually within hours. And so Delta then began to stand out, and the feds recognized the fact that there's a problem here that was just uncovered. The passengers had horror stories. Obviously, they were stranded. They couldn't get to places. They couldn't even figure out what the next step was in order to get to where they needed to go because the systems were all down and had failed. There were children that were stranded because they had issues verifying identities and things like that and making sure that they were matching parents and kids and everything else. And then the best part is that during the midst of all of this, the CEO decided to take a first-class flight to Paris in order to go to the Olympics. And I'm not saying he didn't need to be there at the Olympics, but I think the communication here was something that left a lot to be desired. And unfortunately, when we look at this statement from his own union, his own association of flight attendants, it said that while Ed was flying to Paris last night, crew were sleeping in airports across the country. Flight attendants expect an apology and accountability. And what I see here is when you talk about your value of servant leadership, but at the same time, if your CEO is on a first-class flight out to the Olympics while the rest of your crew is sleeping across airports to try to fix this problem, then we have a major issue. And so what I wanted to bring back up are these 4 types of conversations. And if you would just take a second to respond to this question in the chat, which of the following types of these conversations do you feel were deficient at Delta as revealed by the CrowdStrike shutdown? Courageous conversations, absolutely. Other thoughts? Alignment. We're talking about goals, values, responsibility, absolutely. Not a lot to celebrate here. Wasn't expecting that response. So, but I would agree. Courageous conversations and alignment are probably 2 things that really need to be happening more at Delta. What I find interesting is just about a week ago, there was an update, and Delta is now suing CrowdStrike for, I think, $500 million and blaming them for all the issues they faced. And the best part is CrowdStrike made a statement back that said, don't try to blame CrowdStrike for your issues. Every other airline managed to recover. You did not. And basically told them you need to look in the mirror instead of trying to point the blame somewhere else. And so I use this as an example to illustrate that, sometimes things on the surface look great. And oftentimes we think that we have it together. But when we start to dig down deeper and we start to look at the actual fabric of our teams and our organizations, we have to be honest with ourselves about where do we sit in each of these areas? Where do our teams sit when it comes to psychological safety and accountability? And how are we conversing, I should say, with each other? How are we interacting with each other to ensure that there's open lines of communication, to ensure that we're working collaboratively together to avoid the disasters that oftentimes catch us by surprise? So the second phase of kind of what we're going to be working on today is, why don't good plans always equal great results? So when we think about that, there's a number of barriers to reaching quality results. There's organizational barriers. And so what that means are, something like we have too many goals, we don't really know what we're actually trying to pursue. We don't know how we're measuring our success. And then the biggest part is that we don't know who is doing what, and we don't know what the accountability is for timelines. And so those organizational barriers can be the first way that we completely lose sight of our results. We completely railroad ourselves away from positive progress. The second layer here are psychological barriers. People that continuously feel like, I'm doing everything I can. I don't know what else you want from me. Or I'm doing what I can with what I have. If you want me to do more, I need more people, I need more time, I need more money. Or maybe the employee that's been with you for a while, we've tried that. It's not going to work. Or I've seen the pendulum swing this way, or this happened 10 years ago. We can't do this again. It was shut down last time. I tried it already. And that becomes this culture within your organization with these psychological barriers. And then lastly, the culture barriers, as I just mentioned, is the result of the first two. So with organizational barriers and psychological barriers continuously put in the way of progress, you end up with low performance norms, and then there's this lack of follow through and commitment to what's getting done. And people justify it by saying, well, this isn't really a problem. I don't need to innovate. Everything seems to be working pretty well. So we need to remove these barriers. We need to lean into figuring out ways to then address them openly with our teams and figure out ways to overcome each of these challenges. So I'm going to use a quick other airline example here to couch this. Back in the 90s, Korean Air had some major issues. They had hundreds of people that were unfortunately dying because of the issues they were having in the cockpit, essentially. What was happening is that these cockpits were very insular because they were hiring individuals to fly the planes that were former Air Force pilots from the Korean Air Force. So they were very militaristic, and they were very of the mind that what I say goes. It's very hierarchical. The communication was stifled, meaning if anybody else identified a problem that was happening, they actually felt fearful of notifying the pilot because of retribution. And so that hierarchical culture was creating toxicity. The pilots were basically just demanding things, and everybody else obeyed what they said, and there was no discussion about it whatsoever. And the way they revealed this was actually when one of the planes crashed. They went back in the black box, and they realized that one of the co-pilots had identified the fact that the plane was most likely going to crash. And unfortunately, the way that this was conveyed to the pilot was very passive and in a very weak way. And the pilot basically said, like, thanks for sharing, but we're not doing anything differently. I know what I'm doing. And just a few minutes later, the plane actually crashed into a mountain. And so when we think about this, and we think about what was happening in the cockpits of those planes and the hierarchical culture, the question I have for you is, was the root of the problem of Korean Air back in the 90s, based on just that previous slide, was that in their culture, or was the root of the problem in their behavior? And we're going to talk about what those two things mean here in a second. But if you want to respond in the chat, do you believe that the problem is in the overall culture, or is the root of the problem in their behavior? Thank you, Kelly. Absolutely, in both. Anyone else want to make a strong argument? Culture, both behavior and culture. Okay. I appreciate those responses, because the reality is it is both. But in order for organizations to move forward, we have to address behavior. We have to hold people accountable for their behavior, because behavior obviously then generates a culture. It creates a culture, but they obviously feed off of each other. So somewhat of a trick question here, right? Which I think you probably all read into. So what did Korean Air do? Well, they addressed the behavior. They forced change to the behavior in order to improve results. So they trained the pilots differently. They made sure that they gave them time to train, and if they didn't train, then they were taken out of the cockpit and they were grounded. They increased communication. They trained people in pairs. They made sure that they were able to actually speak a common language. Some of them didn't even speak the same language. And then they stopped hiring individuals from the military who had this very hierarchical perspective on the way that things should be run. And because they changed and addressed the behavior, they were able to shift the culture to something that was more psychologically safe. And eventually, they were actually awarded many different awards in the early 2000s for safety and accountability and responsibility of their organization. And so what that takes us to is this idea that we are all learners. And I'm going to skip over a couple things. I want to make sure I get to our 7 strategies here as well. But the idea is when we talk to our teams, we have to establish the fact that each one of us is a learner. And as a team, we are learners. And so when we think about what stifles learning, these 4 things are what come to mind for me. And I'm sure each of you and your teams have some similar ideas about why or how teams can stifle learning. Is anxiety, fear, we're not sharing, or we feel that we're imitating others because we're trying to act like the person we want to be, or we're trying to act like we're deserving of a different role than the one we have. We're aspiring to do something differently. Things that promote learning, on the other hand, is the idea of psychological safety, openness, flexibility, and interdependence, and realizing that we are focusing here as a team on what happened rather than who did it. We're not pointing fingers. We are all sharing responsibility for overcoming challenges that we've identified. We also make sure that as a team, in order to create the psychological safety, we're comfortable not just looking for one single answer or a correct answer, but we're all trying to learn together. So we're trying different things. We're looking at different options. We're putting people in charge of different pilot programs or interventions, and we're seeing what works. We're testing. And that's really the heart of a learning team. And then we obviously, as a team, we learn together, we grow together, and then we learn more together because the key there is that we're working together and progressing as one. For accountability, again, I mentioned this earlier, you don't replace accountability with psychological safety. They have to be in harmony with each other. And if you lose balance there, that's when you lose the idea of a team that is learning together. And so if you have a psychologically safe team, it actually gives you more opportunities to have those courageous conversations to hold folks accountable. And so again, they play together, they play off of each other. So how do we do both of these things? How do we improve in each area? In my mind, we improve our conversations. And those are conversations, again, that we have with individuals as well as with our teams at the table, small groups, however you want to look at that, but any conversation is an opportunity to do that. So I wanted to provide you with 7 takeaway methods to improve the conversations with your teams. And I'm going to go through each one of these individually. First and foremost is the KDR method. And this is when we deliver feedback. We want our feedback to be kind, direct, and respectful, balancing all 3 of those things, because feedback is necessary and it is part of the learning process. What I like to say is this isn't about your mama. This is just information I'm providing you. And I never say that in an actual meeting, but in my head, I'm thinking, I'm not addressing you in your personal attributes. I'm providing you information that will help you grow. And it is necessary for me to do this because I need our team to continue to progress. And so you think of a time maybe where you've delivered feedback recently, and I would just ask you to reflect on the idea of, was that feedback kind, direct, and respectful? And if it wasn't, which of those 3 areas do you need to improve upon? And then how might you go about that conversation differently next time? But it's a great way to think about having those courageous conversations is kind, direct, and respectful. I know I have about 10 minutes, so we'll have plenty of time to get through these 7. If you have any questions as I go, feel free to dump them in the chat. The second one is similar to the first. It's more of an extension of it, but it's the idea of delivering the last 10%. And what I mean by that is when we deliver critical feedback in a courageous conversation, we often stop short of providing the person with the full truth because we don't want to hurt their feelings or we don't want to ruin our relationship with them. But then we realize later that this person maybe didn't hear what we wanted them to hear. And that last 10% is extremely important to provide clear corrective direction. One example I'll give for this one is recently I had a conversation with an employee, and it was about a very poor classroom observation that occurred. And I laid out for him the different things that I needed him to improve upon by the next time that we did a follow-up. And I kind of left it at that. But then the next time I did the follow-up, I realized I didn't really deliver the last 10% in that I didn't specifically tell him what was it that I was looking for in the follow-up. And I don't know why I failed to do that or fell short, but it's really, I think, because I didn't go into the conversation prepared to deliver that last 10%. So in this case, it wasn't necessarily about my personal feelings or me not wanting to hurt his feelings. It was just, we really have to think through what is 100% of that conversation and how do we make sure that we're leaving them in a place where they have clear direction on what to do next or how to correct their actions. Number 3 is delivering the mail to the proper address. And I think we see this in all organizations. I think all of us have done this ourselves because we're looking to people to just vent, to share, commiserate sometimes. And so what happens though is we're going around members of our team and we're having conversation with other members of our team about the situation rather than just going directly to the person where we have the issue. The other side of this, though, is we're oftentimes, as leaders, the recipient of these conversations, right? So we have somebody, let's say, of our inner circle team come to us and say, man, I'm not sure what's going on with so-and-so, but this is really frustrating. And we sometimes we lean into that or we contribute to that. We say, yeah, I'm not sure. Like, is something going on with her? Is something happening? Do you know of anything personally? And what I think we really need to do is direct that person to deliver the mail to the proper address. So the question might be, have you had this conversation with them yet? Have you addressed this with them yet? How did they respond? And then maybe asking, well, when are you going to have that conversation with them? Rather than playing into the emotions or the toxicity, because that reduces trust, we need to figure out ways to redirect people back to their colleague to have that conversation directly. And this is a great coaching conversation when we talk about those 4. Because a lot of people don't really think about this as a way that reduces trust, but it actually is an opportunity to help coach people to have that challenging conversation with their colleague. And so the next time this happens to you, I'd encourage you to think about ways that you can redirect that person in an effort to create more psychological safety within your team, but also there needs to be cross accountability. And so you want to make sure those conversations are happening. The 4th one is this idea of taking things that are under the table and putting them on the table. What I mean by that is it's somewhat of the elephant in the room. And so there may be times as teams that we're sitting around a table and we're talking about some issues, but we're not, as a member of the team, we might think this is, I like that we're talking about this, but this isn't the real problem. And the reason people don't bring it up in conversation is because it can be uncomfortable. It may reveal weaknesses or vulnerability, and they stay silent and they allow that issue to fester under the table. And this avoids a very critical conversation, and it also takes away the ability of the entire team to learn. And so what I'll say in a meeting is like, guys, whatever the real issue is, let's put it on the table, let's talk about it. And I've even said that with like my family at times. It's like, something's going on, guys. Like, what's going on here? We'll put it on the table. Let's talk about it and open the team up to having those conversations. You need leaders within your team that are willing to do this in order to set the example, and it becomes part of the norm. No meetings after the meeting. This one's probably the most self-explanatory, but when we adjourn from a meeting and you walk out in the hallway and you see 2 or 3 people having a conversation 10 seconds later, we assume that there's some conversations and debrief happening there. Sometimes that's okay. I understand that. Maybe they're unpacking some things together. Maybe they're talking about things, but oftentimes this can be toxic, or even the perception of these conversations can create toxicity. You walk out in the parking lot to leave and you see 2 people talking and whispering together. They might be talking about something completely irrelevant and unrelated to the meeting you just had. However, it's the perception of that can oftentimes lead to distrust. And so if somebody tries to involve you in a meeting after the meeting, I would encourage you to think about ways that you can redirect that conversation and point people back to bringing those issues from under the table and putting them on the table, so there is no need for a meeting after the meeting. The 6th way to improve conversations is this idea of directly addressing a quiet team. And quiet moments in meetings, I will say, of course, can be healthy. People need time to process, so they need time to digest some things, and you might need to table the topic until another time when you get together. But in these situations, what I often will say to my team is, why is everybody so quiet right now? Or is this just the time we need more time to think about this? Like, what's the reason we're not contributing here? And I will tell you, I've started doing that for maybe the last 2, 3 years. And now my team does it to each other. They'll say, why is everybody so quiet? It's almost ironic. But we all laugh, we chuckle, and then we share like why we're being quiet. And at times it is, some people are very vulnerable and they'll say, like, I just personally am having an issue with this, but professionally I think I know the right thing to do. And so I'm conflicted. And then we talk through that and we work through that. But I think sometimes silence can be healthy, but I think other times, and as leaders, we have to keep a pulse on this, but at other times the silence can be a sign that something is unhealthy. And so we want to make sure we're addressing that and we're putting it out there for all of us to discuss. And then the final strategy, or the final way that we can improve conversations in order to improve psychological safety and accountability, is when we look at data, or we're looking at information, results, outcomes, things like that. Oftentimes we have this urgency, or the sense of urgency, to figure out, like, who did this? Who's responsible for this? How can we tackle this? We need to talk to this person. The reality is that's not necessarily going to help us as an organization. We need to focus more on what happened. And the reason that this idea of what happened is important is it creates a culture within your team of shared responsibility. So when we look at student data, for example, I think sometimes we look at, like, who's the teacher in the class, or is this kid in a program with so-and-so because this person and that person designed it, yada, yada. And what we're doing, though, is we're wasting our time, because we may need to address an individual or a professional within the organization. There may be an issue that's happening. We need to have a courageous conversation. But the reality is the data is actually telling a bigger story. And so the question we might need to ask is, like, what do these students have in common? Or what was the scenario that created the conditions for these students to do so poorly? The other side of that conversation might be a celebratory one. How can we celebrate this as a team? How can we create a storyline around this, or a narrative around this, to celebrate what's happening? And how do we create this condition for these students to be successful? And how do we bring that condition to other students as well? So when you're talking about data, I would just encourage you to focus less on who's responsible and more on what happened. What were the conditions that created either positive or negative outcomes? And again, that just creates a sense of shared responsibility. So I have about 7 minutes left. I'm just going to put these up on the screen here, and I'm going to skip the last small portion of the presentation because I want to make sure I leave some time for questions and things. But the last thing I was going to just touch on again is this quadrant. And so in summation, really the objective of the time here today, and I apologize, it's a lot in a short amount of time. I'm always here, happy to answer questions or provide information offline, if you will. But the real goal here is to create teams and organizations that are learners. And personally for me, I have, like I said, been fortunate to be on many teams that are very successful and they're very learning focused. And it's a joy to be on those teams. But at the same time, as leaders, we all have the responsibility to continuously work towards improvement in each of these areas. And so I hope that today you found some different takeaway strategies, some different things that you can utilize with your teams to start to move them in this direction of that level of high accountability and high psychological safety. So I appreciate the time. Looks like we have 5-6 minutes left. Are there any questions that you'd like to put in the chat that I can respond to? If there's anything, feel free to put in the chat. You could feel free to email me, and that is my cell number. You can text me, set up a time to talk, whatever that might look like for you. And I'm happy to be here to share more. And then I think, Arlen, as you mentioned, you're going to have this recording sent out as well.
Absolutely, Neil. We want to thank you so much for sharing today on the power of these courageous conversations with our teams. Terrific information. Really appreciated this webinar. And as you said, it has been recorded, and I'll be sending out the link tomorrow morning, as well as a link to, yes, the slides, Angela. Neil, could you give me the slides as a PDF?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, I'll link that up and send that out tomorrow with the recording. But you'll also be getting an evaluation to complete to get your feedback on this presentation. And if you're an Illinois participant, the evaluation will be required to get your ISB evidence of completion form for 1 PD clock hour for your attendance this afternoon. But thank you, Neil, for leaving some time for questions. There's still plenty of us hanging around. So if you've got questions, comments, thank yous, anything you want to type into the chat, we've got plenty of time to address it. Awesome. Thank you, Angela.
All right, Arlen, I just sent that off to you, so you have those slides.
Okay, thank you. And if you don't have any questions, feel free to hover down in the lower right-hand corner of your Zoom screen, and you'll be able to exit the webinar. That'll let us know you're all set, and I'll be following up with everyone tomorrow with the recording. I'm gonna go ahead and turn it off.